So in our previous video, you might remember that we worked with some real-world numbers that were in a CSV file, and we trained an artificial neural network, and then we had that network do predictions for us, which also created a CSV file, and we were about 88% correct. And we made this business scenario where, if we know in advance which customers will join our preferred program, then we can use our resources more wisely and we can have a better operation. And that was all fine and dandy, but where did the data come from? And you may have noticed that there's an Access database in that same folder. And in that Access database, we have the same list because this is our production system, and we want to integrate our prediction system into Microsoft Access so that we can have the benefits of machine learning in our application. And so imagine if you had a whole bunch of cases or customers or whatever in your Access database. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a button that you could click that would learn from the data that you already have in order to show you things in advance with a certain amount of certainty that will be correct? Well, these days, more and more systems are doing exactly that, and I think that a lot of people are starting to ask for these features because it makes their job a lot easier. And so now that I've clicked our predict button on our system here, you can see on the right side, before I even know with all of those new customers, customers after, say, row 251 there, you can see that they've been predicted, and so now I can approach those customers or cases or whatever it is that you have in your system. You can approach that differently than you might if you were going in blind. I'm your host, Sean MacKenzie. Thanks for joining me once again on my channel on data engineering. In this episode, we go back to our Microsoft Access playlist, and we're going to integrate an artificial intelligence model that we developed in a previous episode, and we're going to use it to do some classification, and in this case it's going to be prediction of certain outcomes based on a data set that we have in our database. So without further ado, let's get to it. Interested in cool further topics like the one you saw today? Make sure to check out my Patreon. The link is in the description. Okay guys, this is a really cool one. As I mentioned, there is an Access database in that directory, and it actually is responsible for those two customer test and customer train CSV files, and then preferred is the output file from our AI. And of course the script for AI is the Python below there, which we created in our previous episode. And so everything that we need is there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually run our Python script. I'm going to run it in a batch file. You can actually call certain scripts directly when you're calling them, as we're going to call them using shell, wscript.shell, but I do find that in many cases they run more nicely when they've been called through a .cmd or a .bat file, and so I'm going to use that method today. I'll put a title at the top of the batch file saying executing machine learning procedure, and then I'm just going to I'll put a remark in there, and AI is awesome or something like that, and we can then put in the path to call Python in order to execute the Python script. Now I'm putting in this big long Python directory in there because I'm using a second installation of Python in my machine. You will probably just need to put python.exe space and then the name of your script if you've installed Python and it's the default installation. In my case, I have to point to Python 3.8, which is the one that I used for our machine learning. And so I'll save that, and I'm going to save that and run it. And when I kick it off, it goes through all of the epoch, just like we saw in our last video, and then it spits out a file called preferred. And preferred has all of the predicted values for the customers that are new, that we have not seen with our machine learning. And so what I'm going to do is I've gone back to our Access database, and I'm going to put into our customer detail table, I'm going to put in a new field called predicted score so that we can put that in alongside of our actual scores that happen when the customer actually decides to become part of the preferred program in this case. And so now when I open our table, it's a very simple table. It has a bunch of categorical data in it, if you remember, and it has a preferred score in there, which is filled out for all of the customers that have been processed, but we have a whole bunch of customers that are not processed, and so we're going to make predictions for those customers so that we have a better approach to handling their file. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a form. I'm going to make a very basic form using the form wizard here. I'm going to choose a tabular format just so that we can see the list of customers and their attributes. And so I'll say customer detail form, I'll call it, and I'll modify the form design here. You can see the form has the categories. I created those with drop downs, and so that's all set up for us already, and I just need to do a little bit of design work here so that our form looks a little bit nicer and we can fit it onto the screen that you see here. So I'm going to just change the size of that title. I'm not going to do too much design here. I just want to make things fit, so I'm just going to grab these here, going to fit our region and our credit score over so that we can fit everything on screen, and we can also see our new predicted score when it is imported into the database, or integrated, as you might say. And so this form is going to be our main piece of work here today. So we're going to create the form, and then we're going to use the code behind for the form. So we're going to use VBA today, and what we're going to do is we're going to use VBA in the code behind so that all of the code and form objects and everything are all in one, and that makes it very nice and easy to maintain. And so you might be wondering, why am I looking at region, credit score, borrow size, and marital status? And the answer is that those are our features that are passed into our machine learning algorithm, and they are used to learn from. And so if you found a statistician and said, can you predict for me, what the likelihood of, this customer being a 1 or 0 is, well, they can run it through a statistical model, and they could, probably based on the, how the data works together, they could give you some idea of what that is. But a computer and especially a neural network, is going to learn much more intensively, and so what it can do is it can apply a lot more statistics and generate those relationships between neurons and things, and it learns from the data. And so a machine learning model is going to be very much more powerful than a single statistical model might be. Okay, so we've got our form here, and now we've got our form. So let's go and drop a button in the form header. I'm going to cancel the wizard that pops up there, and we're going to use this button to kick off our machine learning procedure to do all of the calculations using an artificial neural network that we created in our previous episode. And so what I'll do here is I'll right click on our predict button there, and I'll go to properties, and then I'm going to go to the other tab, and I'm going to put in CMD predict, so I have a nice name for our button. And I can click on the event tab and then click on the ellipsis next to on click, because we're going to have an on click event every time the button is clicked. And that'll give us our nice little code window here, our IDE, which has Visual Basic for Applications in it. and we are going to do some work in here. And so one of the things we're going to add before we start putting some code into our CMD predict click event there is we're going to add a private declare, and we're going to use the sleep function or sleep sub from our kernel 32, and that's going to allow us to tell our program to wait for a certain amount of time while our outside process that's executing in our Python script is running. And so that's really going to be handy for us to be able to just sleep for a few seconds while the program runs, because we created a very simple neural network and it runs very quickly, and so that's one of the benefits of having a very simple artificial neural network, or ANN, and you can run it very quickly, and it's not quite as powerful as if you extended your model and maybe even got into deep learning territory, but it is very, very powerful, especially when there's good patterns in the data, I guess I would say, and you can actually predict nicely using your model. And so we're going to use some variables here, and I'm going to be using our shell variable, which we covered in a previous episode. You can find it in the card above here, and I'm going to use a variant return value that I'm just going to have in order to capture if in case there's a null. And I've got a check integer, a file string, and an SQL string, and we're going to use each of those as follows. The file is going to be our C folder that we have where we have our CSV, and this is the file that we're going to use. It's the output file from our Python procedure that has the predicted values for the customers that have not been processed yet in our operation. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use that awesome command called kill, and we're going to kill that file in case it's there. You can put an on error resume next, or you can trap that error if the file isn't there. I'm going to assume today that the file is there, because we've run this many times, and it'll delete that file. And then we're going to set that shell object to create object wscript.shell, and this is a late binding example, and so we don't have the benefit of the IntelliSense, but you can go object shell.run and then put in the name of the script that you want, and then we'll put a comma and 0 in order to have our batch file that we created earlier. We'll have that execute hidden so that it doesn't pop up in front of the user with all that crazy stuff going on with all of the epoch and everything. That'll probably scare most users. And then we'll use a for next loop, which I also covered in a previous episode. You can check that out by seeing the card up above here. We're going to use a for next loop to go 5 times, and inside of that loop we're going to sleep for 5 seconds using the sleep that we declared above. So it's going to wait 5 seconds, and then it's going to check for that preferred file that we deleted, and then if it happens to be there, we'll use the dir command there, dir, and if that returns a length of greater than 0, then we'll go ahead and import the results into our access database using do command.transferText, and we'll import a delimited file, and you can see it's going to ask me where do you want to put that. I'm going to put that into a table called predictions, and I'm going to grab our file, which is str file, and I'm going to say that that file has the first row is the column names. And so very simple command, do command.transferText. That's going to import that file into our database, And then once we have that in Access, then of course we have all of the power of our Microsoft Access, and we can just do an update statement to update our data that's in our production table. And so I'll just do a quick update here. So what we're going to do is we're going to update our production table using the customer ID field. So we're going to say update customer detail, and we're going to inner join our prediction table on customer ID equals customer ID. So we'll say customer detail.customer ID is equal to predictions.customer ID, and that will be a very quick and efficient update of our production table to put those predictions into our system so that our users can see what the machine learning prediction is, and therefore make better decisions on whatever process it is that they are using this for. In this case, it's our preferred customer program. And so we'll set that customer detail dot predicted score equal to predictions dot preferred score, and then I'm going to do a quick do command. I'll set warning false. That's going to ignore the warnings from do you want to update so many rows, and we'll just run our SQL. And then after that we'll do me.requery. This is a nice thing about using the code behind for the form, is that we can just say me for the form and requery, and then it just requeries and gets the latest data. And then we can say a message box, predicted score is imported, please proceed, or whatever you want to put in there. And I'll put a VB information style on that message box, and then we can exit our sub. So this is important because we don't want to keep going if it finds it after 2 of those 5-second intervals. We don't want to continue running it or waiting for it. We just want to exit out of the sub. We've got our data, we've notified our user, and we're just going to get out of there. However, if it goes past the 5 times, now you could put 10 times in if your computer's slower, or for your int check equals 1 to 10 you could put, or 1 to 20 if you really need to wait. But if it makes it past the end of the waiting period, then you can put a message for the user that says predictions could not be retrieved after 5 tries. And so that'll give a nice message to the user saying, hey, maybe something went wrong, or maybe it's taking way too long. We might need to do this again, or do it another way, or whatever. So there's our message. Predicted score is imported. That's the one that we want to see, and that should do it for this procedure. We're going to add a bit to this procedure, but for now we're going to just execute our process, and I'm going to check a few things here. I'm going to put an option explicit. Thanks to those who have asked me to put that in there, because it makes it so that all of our variables need to be declared, and that can make it easier for troubleshooting. I think I've got everything I need in here right now. We will be adding some more to it, like I said, but there's our shell, our return variable, our check variable, and our file and SQL variables. And those are all there. There's our SQL that's going to update our system with the predicted scores. And of course, this is happening inside of the for next loop with a sleep. And the sleep is going to pause and wait for it to finish running. And then it'll update the system. And if it doesn't, it'll give a message saying we could not update the system because it didn't finish in time. And so when we're done, what we should see is our predicted scores updated. And so I'll go to our form view, and you can see all of our features there, our categorical variables, and you can see that it's empty in the predicted column there and the preferred column, because These cases have not, or customers have not been processed yet, but we do have the previous scores in there that we are going to send to our machine learning program to learn from. And starting at 251 is where we're going to start predicting. And so that's sort of how that works. And so we're going to use that whole data set of 250 rows. And what we're going to do is we're going to hit predict, and we're going to wait. And we're waiting now. That machine learning program is running in the background. And you can see we did get an hourglass here as it has gone to not responding, but then it comes back pretty quickly saying predicted scores imported and please proceed. So it looks like it worked, so we'll go OK. And then we can check our form here by just scrolling down to the end and see, and there, yeah, there we have our values for our predicted scores, and we know that these are about 88% correct because that is what showed up in our machine learning validation. And so there you go. So now as we move forward with these customers in our company, we can now have an idea of whether those customers will be joining the preferred program or not, or if they're more likely to join, and those kinds of things. But of course, we have to bring this thing full circle, and we need to know, was this thing actually accurate? And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to import the actual scores for those customers so that we can compare what the real value was in the real world, not the predicted world, and we can compare it to our predicted scores. Now we did get a measure back from validation that said that we were about 88% accurate, I think it was. And so I'm going to import this customer detail from a backup file of the same database, just so that we have something to compare with. And that was our test data set. And so now I have the real scores in customer detail 1, and I'm going to update our customer detail table with the real scores. So after our prediction was done, and then we actually had our customers go through, and we can see what the actual scores were. And in a similar fashion to our previous query that we did in VBA, I'm going to do an update query using customer ID as a join, and I'm just going to say update the preferred score with the preferred score from the original data, and we'll get a sense. So we can do customer detail 1 dot customer or preferred score. There we go. So now we're going to update to that based off of the join. So if I hit run on that, it will give me some results. It should say 324. So that's the entire data set, which is the same. 250 of those are the same, and the rest were empty in our database that we were developing. But now if I go down to the end here, we can see that our predicted was very close to the actual preferred score. There were some that did not make it, so there's one there that was not correct on the prediction. Some were the same, the majority were the same, some were not the same, and that's exactly what we want to see. We want to see a good, healthy prediction for what's actually going to happen. And now we can use that model to predict, thousands more records or hundreds of thousands more records. If we wanted to, we can use that same model, and that's where the power comes, is that now we have this prediction engine, and it's going to be awesome. And as you can see, I can rerun our process again if I want, and it can do the prediction against the data set again, and it won't be exactly the same, but that is essentially a full circle going from access to machine learning and back, and that's what we want to see. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, where did these files come from in our ANN folder? And the answer is that those files were manual exports from our database, our credit preferred database up above there, that were nice and easy to import for the Python program. Now we can automate the export, however, the question becomes, should we automate the export? Because as I'll show you in upcoming episodes, we don't really want to train our model every time. The idea is actually to train it one time, and then you can use it on, say, customer test to do lots of prediction for lots of records after we've trained and tested it, and we know that it's pretty accurate. That being said, though, you certainly can train it each time if you want to, especially if you have a very simple artificial neural network, and so that could be something that you want to do, and it really depends on your situation and the context of where and how you're using it. And in future episodes, we certainly will be covering some deep learning models which are much more accurate and rich, and we'll be using those, and you certainly won't want to do your training every time with those models. Now, if you would like to add the export step just before you run your model, and you want to automate that part, you certainly can. I'll show you very quickly here. You can go to your form design, and we'll click on our button there, and we're going to add a few lines of code. And there we go. So here's our procedure, and if you wanted to do both of those files or one or the other of those files and have it automatically go into that folder each time, you can certainly add a couple of lines or one or the other. You can do a do command transfer text, and that will allow us to do an AC export delimited. And we're not going to use the specification name today, but you could if you had a very specific output. And we'll grab that table name. We're going to output the table that we want. In this case, it was a query that had our training data set. So we queried, and we had a certain amount or number of the records or type of record from that one table that we put into a query. Customer train, and we're going to output that query into our target directory, and we'll put a true on the end there to put the column headers in, the field names, and I'll copy and paste that, and you could also use that for your test data set, or as we look further at this, it won't be a test data set anymore. It'll actually be like a huge data set that you want to actually run a whole bunch of predictions on after you've tested it. It really depends on your situation. Are you a programmer looking for your next gig? Make sure to check out the additional links in the description.